Hello everybody, good evening. Welcome to Senate House, and welcome, if not physically, at least in spirit, to the Institute of Classical Studies. As many of you know, we're upstairs on the 3rd floor. My name's Catherine Harlow, and since October 2021, I've been the Director of the Institute of Classical Studies. And so it's my great pleasure to be hosting this, which is the 11th J.P. Barron Memorial Lecture, after a pause for the pandemic. I'm not someone who knew John Barron personally. I was a lowly undergraduate while he was the Master of St. Peter's, but I know many things about him and the way in which he has made his mark on our discipline and many other disciplines through obviously his scholarship, and we'll hear about that this evening, and through his institutional leadership of various kinds. And especially as this is going to be the final John Barron Memorial Lecture, I wanted to express my thanks to Caroline Barron, very, very important part of the Institute of Historical Research community, and as well as part of our community in the ICS, and also to Katie and to Helen, John's daughters. I also just wanted to say it feels a huge privilege that we've been able to have these lectures in London. Thank you for your generosity in supporting this series here. I was looking back at some of the things John Barron wrote when he was Institute Director, and also at what colleagues in classics have to say about him. And I just want to say, I think he's very much part of London, someone whose career was made in London. I was talking about the intercollegiate MA in classics at one point earlier today, and it occurred to me that he worked in all of the institutions, I think, that contribute to the intercollegiate MA in classics now. So Bedford College, which is now part of Royal Holloway, UCL and KCL, and of course in the Institute of Classical Studies as well, and had a remarkable variety of job titles, ranging from Latin to archaeology and numismatics to Greek language and literature. And it's really hard to imagine someone occupying positions with all of those different titles in a classics department today. But on that note, I am going to shut up and hand over to people who knew John Barron much better than I did. And the first person who's going to come up and say a little is Katie, John's daughter, who wants to say a bit about her father.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's very fitting and an honour that Professor John Gabriel, a specialist in Eastern Christianity, should give this lecture to commemorate our dad. I'm one of John Barron's 2 daughters. Helen is here too. And I just wanted to say a few words about Dad's interest in Greece and the Byzantine world. Dad was born in the 1930s in Yorkshire. His father was a maths teacher at Morley Comprehensive School near Leeds, and the family didn't go on holidays abroad. Dad graduated in classics from Balliol College, Oxford, where John Paul Gabriel is now, and specialised in Greek archaeology without ever having visited Greece. Dad's first trip to Greece was in his 20s, when he was working on his PhD about the silver coins of the island of Samos in the classical period. Dad fell in love with Greece, which would have seemed even more different from the England of the 1950s than it does from England today. He loved the food and wine, the warmth and pride of the people he met, the zestful music, the devotional approach to Christianity. Later, he felt very privileged to be a lecturer on Swan Hellenic cruises, thereby getting free trips to Greece in the 1970s and 1980s. And he admired the patriotic spirit of the Greek guides at the sites, who were always correcting the English lecturers and trying to gain his ear about the Elgin marbles. As a professor of Greek at King's College London, and then master of St. Peter's College, Oxford, Dad enjoyed developing relationships with the Greek community in the UK. He became good friends with the Lemos family, who took him on a trip to Mount Athos to visit the working monasteries there after he retired, which he found very moving and inspiring. All of these influences gradually drew Dad out of the classical era and towards studying the Byzantine world. In particular, as you will hear from my mum and from Professor Gabriel, he espoused the cause of a 17th century Greek archbishop, not sure how to pronounce it, Georgianis, Archbishop of Samos. Georgianis wrote a guidebook to Samos and Patmos in 1677, which Dad had found useful when he was studying Samos. Like Dad, Archbishop Georgianis seems to have been socially ambitious and also enjoyed trying to found things and set things up. Dad was known in Oxford for trying to acquire the prison for St. Peter's College to house the students. Archbishop Georgianis, as you will hear, I think, raised the money for the first Greek church in London, just off Soho Square, before being chucked out of the country following accusations that he was involved in a Catholic plot. At that point, as far as Dad knew, the trail went cold, but you will hear more about this wandering archbishop. Dad wrote an article about Georgianis, and then when he retired, he decided to tackle writing a biography, which he was still doing when he died. A few months before Dad died, before he'd been diagnosed with anything, he made a trip to the island of Patmos. Dad wanted to find on the island all the places that Georgianis had mentioned in his guidebook. I decided to accompany Dad, and I'm glad I did, as it was his last trip to Greece. It is the right place. No? That was Jen. A couple of things stand out from our Patmos trip, alongside the delicious stuffed peppers. One was our visit to the Monastery of St. John, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which venerates the writer of the Book of Revelation. When we were in one of the chambers of the monastery, a very tall, broad-shouldered monk with a bushy beard appeared. My father instantly picked up the man's hand and kissed it. I was quite taken aback, but apparently this was the correct act in the circumstances. It reminded me of when I was a little girl and I went to see Dad being public orator for the University of London. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was Chancellor at the time. Dad would keep interrupting the speeches to turn around to the Queen Mother and say, "You will remember, Ma'am," and lift off his mortarboard and then put it back on again, sometimes with difficulty. I don't know where he learned about doing these things. Perhaps he sat up late reading books about etiquette. Dad wanted to photograph the monastery from every conceivable angle. This meant that we had to wander into the countryside, where there were no paths nor any streams, as the island of Patmos consists of porous rock. In the time of St. John, the lack of surface water was a good reason to drop a troublesome Christian there. Dad wandered away, busily clicking his camera, an analog camera in a leather case. Then he disappeared. I was anxious, as I felt he was a little more vulnerable than he used to be. I rushed over to where I'd last seen him. The land was full of deep ravines, and I suddenly realized that he could be lying at the bottom of any one of them. I wandered and wandered for about half an hour, and finally came upon a shepherd who was sitting against a tree, surrounded by his goats. He was staring into space. It was in the days before smartphones. I racked my brains for some ancient Greek words and pronounced them with lots of I sounds to make them sound like modern Greek, which was what Dad had taught me to do. I said, "Where is my father? A big man." The shepherd stared at me for a long time, and then he swiveled suddenly and pointed with a straight arm up the hill. I set off in the direction of his arm, and in a few minutes I found Dad, still happily clicking away with his camera. Happy thought that when we lose a loved one, we could just ask some shepherd and walk up the hill a little way, and there our loved ones would be happily clicking away. It's a feeling that merits churches and archbishops. One of the things that helps is continuity. It's lovely to see so many people here who knew our dad. Also, Mum, Professor Caroline Barron, and Professor Jonathan Harris, and Professor John Paul Gabriel all worked hard to complete Dad's biography of George Irenaeus and managed to find out what the Archbishop did next, which was even more adventurous than the part Dad knew about. So I'm very grateful both for all the work to complete Dad's book and that Professor Gabriel is going to entertain us this evening with a deeper understanding of improvisation and authenticity for George Irenaeus and his milieu. Thank you.
Well, there's not much left for me to say. If you have daughters like Katie, they steal your thunder. Thank you, Katie. That was very interesting. You told me things I hadn't heard about that. That was nice. Catherine has told us about the Institute of Technical Studies. Katie has told you about her father, my husband, John. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about John Paul Gabriel before he tells us himself. But I wanted to say something about how it was that you came to be interested in George Irenaeus. And as Katie has explained to you, John was writing a biography of this Archbishop of Samos, Joseph George Irenaeus, and he hadn't finished it when he died. And as Katie said, I had the help of Jonathan Harris, who's here today, who wrote the chapter on Constantinople. And many people helped with bringing the book to fruition. And I thought, in about, the year, 2015, that we were almost there. Actually, no, a bit earlier than that, 2013. And then I got an email. And I have a wonderful emails filing system, which is simply chronological. And if I go back far enough into my computer, I'll find what I want. And this is the first message I had from John Paul, and it's dated the 17th of May, 2012. And he says, very polite introduction and so on, and then he says, I wonder if you can tell me about your husband's work. In part, this interests me because I first came across Joseph of Samos in a rather different context, in Spanish sources dating some 20 years after his appearance in London. He left London in 1682. And I'm wondering how I might begin to connect the dots, so to speak, from the details mentioned in John's 26 article. I suspect that Professor Barron turned up every last shred of evidence about this curious globetrotter, and I wonder whether he followed him as far as the New World. And as you can imagine, I was absolutely ecstatic at finding that Joseph George Irenaeus had left England. He had actually gone to Spain and then on to the New World, and he'd been tracked down, and that was extremely exciting. Well, of course, it delayed the book for a bit longer, but John Paul very kindly wrote an epilogue for John's book, and we have copies of the book there if you haven't seen it already. And that was, a very exciting extension, as it were, of John's work. The only trouble was I think John would have been a bit miffed that he didn't find out that himself. But never mind, he didn't work on the Spanish Inquisition, so that's not surprising. So what I suppose is interesting and what we're going to hear about this evening, perhaps, is how John Paul Gabriel takes micro-history and it relates it to global history. And I'm not a global historian, but what I think he's trying to do, forgive me if I get this wrong, is to take individual cases like Joseph George Irenaeus or Elias of Babylon, another person whom you've written about, who came from the Eastern Mediterranean and traveled westwards and then maybe to Spain, to France, and then on to the New World. So these are sort of micro-histories of individual people traveling a global world, as it were, in this case particularly from the east to the west. But it isn't just that he only looks at the people. I know now that John Paul looks at the archives. And he looks at the archives because these people, like Joseph Georgiouris or Elias of Babylon, wrote accounts of what they did or where they'd been, but they had their own agenda. They wrote in a particular way for a particular audience. Sometimes you can track these people down in the archives, and John Paul's great at this, and he knows Arabic, and he knows languages, so he can track them down in all sorts of different places. But the archives are not neutral. The archives themselves are constructed with a particular agenda, and John Paul's very good at teasing out the significance of particular references to these people in the archives. So that's very exciting, and I'm very pleased that he's going to talk to us this evening about this. And he asked the question, were these individuals authentic? Were they imposters? Were they merely trying to navigate their way through unfamiliar territory? If you were an Eastern Christian, an Nestorian Christian, or Greek Orthodox, how do you navigate the way through Roman Catholicism and Protestantism? So, John Paul, thank you for coming, and I look forward tremendously to what you're going to be able to tell us. Thank you.
I'm not sure that there's anything more for me to do this evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Katie. It's an incredible honor and a huge privilege to have been asked to give this last of the series of memorial lectures for John Barron. Looking at the list of previous speakers, I'm very conscious that I am in every single way a complete outlier. First of all, not having known John myself personally, but also as the only speaker who's not working on the ancient world. So I want to use this lecture to reflect on the magic that happens at the frontiers of research when scholars work beyond their own original fields. And I'll do so by reflecting specifically on one aspect of Barron's work in a manner that I hope you'll agree is a fitting way to end a series of memorial lectures. Now, this may be a somewhat unusual talk for the Institute of Classical Studies, because I know John Barron first and foremost as an historian, not of Samos, but as a scholar of the 17th century. So let me start, therefore, by saying something briefly about how I first became acquainted with the work, which you've heard a bit about already from Caroline, but I've got pictures. In 2011, I'd been working away in the archives on the trail of a priest on the trail of a priest from Mosul called Elias of Babylon, or Elias the Babylonian, as you see his signature in the top left, who in the 1670s had traveled all the way from Mosul, Iraq, to Mexico and Peru, where he wrote what appears to have been the first Arabic account of the New World. So the first time you have the New World being described in Arabic. Now, such a journey may seem exceptional, but in fact, in the Spanish archives, I began to encounter several other Eastern Christians who had made such journeys across the Atlantic world. In the paper graveyard of the Spanish Empire, housed today in the Archive of the Indies in Seville, I was especially intrigued to come across such individuals in an array of documents, licenses giving them permission to travel, copies of petitions asking for donations, and even the trial records linked to their encounters with Inquisition officials in Lima. One of these case files, which you've heard something about, described the appearance in 1694 in Buenos Aires of a man described only as José Georgiouris, whose ship, the San Sebastian, had run aground, delivering him and a ragtag group of people in his company directly to the attention of Spanish imperial officials. The man claimed to be the Archbishop of Samos, and the case file comprised some 200 folios describing the efforts made to understand who was this man. How had he gotten here? What was his story? Now, in my experience, such individuals rarely just turn up out of nowhere, parachuted as if from Mars into the archives. So from clues in the case file, it became very clear that the Archbishop, if that's who he was, had traveled at least through Italy, France, and Spain before his arrival in the New World. So when I returned to England, therefore, I focused my research in these directions. Now, what I didn't imagine at the time was that I would find a sign of the Archbishop much closer to home. In fact, just up the road here at the British Library, in an intriguing chapter of a collected volume on Anglicanism and Orthodoxy, edited by Peter Dole and published in 2006. You can see the book cover here. And the piece was written by one John Barron, and it was entitled The Archbishop of Samos and the Prehistory of the Greek College. Now, as I would come to learn, the life of this article, in fact, began over 50 years ago. For it was as a TPhil student at Balliol College that Barron had first come across the Archbishop while writing his dissertation on the history of Samos to 439 BC. And among the sources in the bibliography, one finds reference to the description of Samos written by one Joseph Georgiorines, the Archbishop of Samos. You can find it on page 656 if you're looking. But also, the Archbishop shows up, as I've tried to show here, in the footnotes as well, where it's clear that Barron was using the source to think about issues of the island's geography and water use in the 5th century BC. This wasn't just a magpie throwing an interesting source into a bibliography, not that people ever do that, but actually was using the source to think about the ancient world. Now, others in this room will know more than me about Barron's work on the Archbishop in the years that followed the TPhil. But I should like to mention here a letter I received some time ago from Anthony Papalas, an historian of Icaria based in the United States, who describes having met John during his research on the book. And he writes, "He was a wonderful man, learned, very humble and spiritual. I will always remember how moved he was when we entered the small 17th century Icarian churches. We traversed the island, trying to find traces of the Georgiorines legend. But I'm afraid with tourism, which began to sweep through the island in the 1970s, the traces were very faint." It was, at any rate, after the end of Barron's tenure as Master of St. Peter's that he was able to really advance his work on the Archbishop of Samos. The first fruit of that research, therefore, was the 2006 article, in which Barron described the travails experienced by the Archbishop of Samos as he sought to establish a Greek church in London. And we all know that story ended in failure. 3 things about this article surprised me. First, where all the records I had seen in Spain told a story of the Archbishop's wish to live as a Catholic, the article described a Greek Archbishop who feigned a desire for some sort of intercommunion with the Anglican Church. Second, the article offered a detailed account of the specific steps taken by Georgiorines and his English patrons to establish this church. As Jonathan Harris, who's with us tonight, has taught us, other Greek migrant communities had in fact set up churches of their own, especially in Italy. So that in itself wasn't a surprise, but what was exceptional here was the extraordinary amount of detail that Barron had managed to turn up about this particular episode. And yet, despite this level of detail, the third and most surprising aspect of the article, in my opinion, was that it appeared that none of the sources that Barron had uncovered made any reference to exactly what happened to our Archbishop after his time in London. Indeed, Barron wrote in the article that the Archbishop, quote, died, it is said, 4 years later, and he referred to a book, but of suspect credibility. For the footnote, John writes, no authority is cited for the date of Georgiorines' death. So it was at this point that I reached out first to St. Peter's and then to Caroline herself in hopes of learning more about the status of John's work at his untimely death. And as we know, it turns out that John had left a near intact manuscript, which Caroline carried to completion with the publication in 2017 of From Samos to Soho, The Unorthodox Life of Joseph Georgiorines, a Greek Archbishop. I offered a short epilogue to the book, laying out the bare bones of his adventures in South America, and subsequently in 2019 I published an article of my own in which I laid out the full detail of this final period of the Archbishop's life. Along the way, and when one works on a topic this way, you're always sort of in an imaginary conversation with the giants that have gone before you. And I often like to think about things that someone I never knew might have felt about discoveries that were made. So I learned that long before John and myself were drawn into this story, the Archbishop had caught the attention of the rather strange Argentinian novelist Manuel Mujica Leine, who in 1951 had published a book called Misteriosa Buenos Aires, a collection of short stories telling the history of Buenos Aires from its foundations in 1536 until 1904. One of these stories was entitled The Archbishop of Samos, and it told a fanciful tale of the escape of a Greek archbishop who turns into an owl to escape from a prison in Buenos Aires. Needless to say that this period of research, it was a great joy to be able to reflect on these discoveries with Caroline. I also went back and read through my very well archived emails. And rereading our correspondence and our notes of the meetings, it's been a huge pleasure to return to these memories, which are wrapped up for me also with memories of a distinct moment of my own life as I moved to take up a post at Oxford at John's college, well, John's first college. So much for the background. What are we here to do tonight? Well, let me say something about the book. From Samos to Soho shows all the hallmarks of Barron's scholarship on the ancient world. Lawrence Goldman captured it perfectly in his entry on the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, where he described Barron's talent for hunting down pieces of information, linking them together, and making wider intellectual connections. Moreover, the book showcases the natural talents of an ancient historian who was accustomed to working in a field, as Katie Barron has written, where evidence is scarce and hypotheses have to be constructed with great care. I think, for example, of the slow, purposeful arguments he constructs in his study of the murals of the Tézion. Now, these were not just the refined talents of a mature scholar who had come to his rightness in his work, but rather they showed their presence at a very early stage of John's career, which was the subject of comment by his teachers, people like Kenneth Dover, Stanley Robinson, Anthony Andrews, and of course, Russell Meggs, whose papers I've had occasion to go through recently. In March 1957, for example, Meggs described John as, quote, an enterprising traveler. He is refreshingly keen, has a lively style, and raises interesting questions. His work is often original, and he has a good historical sense. Now, Meggs would go on to say, quote, a comprehensive study of the important island of Samos is needed, and I think that Barron's work would be useful to others as well as to himself. I want to focus on that passage for the rest of this lecture. For it may be easy, especially to those who knew him, to think of John's interest in the Archbishop of Samos as some sort of meaningful footnote on his larger work on the ancient world. However, what I want to do in this lecture is to recover a real sense of the scale of the work and its importance, its ambitions. But to do so, we have to venture bravely out of antiquity, if that can be permitted in the Institute for Classical Studies, and into the labyrinth of early modern history. So in the years since the 2006 article, it's no exaggeration to say that there's been a veritable explosion of works about Eastern Christians in early modern Europe. And like Barron's study, most of this research has been constructed around the study of fascinating individuals. Through the accumulation of one example after another, it has become possible to obtain a vision of the Archbishop of Samos as a specimen of a much wider category of individuals. And if we line up these studies, like so many maquettes in a row, we can highlight here a few aspects of the figure of the Eastern Christian alms collector in Europe. So what I'll do is I'll draw on the research of several scholars and bring it all together here. Already in 1676, Giorgiorini's description of Samos described in detail an organized system for the dispatch of alms collectors by monasteries across the Ottoman Empire. Here is how Giorgiorini's describes the arrangement at Mount Athos. Every year, they select some of their Kalagoroi to go abroad, monks, and to go abroad and beg the charity of Christian people towards the relief of their respective monastery. And these missions are always sent 2 by 2 together. The monasteries agree beforehand to what particular places they will send their respective emissaries, who continue ordinarily 2 or 3 years in their perambulations. And at their coming home, the money is delivered to the skenaphylax, or the steward of the monastery, for it's against the rule of their order to meddle with money. Now, these fundraising missions have a specific name in Greek, the Zideia, and the scale of these missions were such that in 1699, the Jesuit missionary Francois Richard could write that half of the 7,000 monks at Mount Athos were absent on missions, either locally to various metochion or dependencies of Athos, or further afield in foreign lands. Now, this is, of course, an exaggeration, but I think it reflects the scale of these missions stretching as they did internally within the Ottoman Empire, but also internationally to Central Europe, Russia, Western and Northern Europe, and as we've seen, even as far as the Americas. Now, these missions were not only a feature of the Greek Orthodox Church, but they were also central to the economies of other Eastern Christian communities. For example, the Maronites, the Syrian Orthodox, or the Nestorians, whose monastery, the Church of the East, East Syrians, whose monastery, Rabban Hormuzd, you see pictured here. Missions to Europe in particular were normally entrusted either to senior figures within the communities or individuals who possessed the personal qualities needed for such work. For example, charisma, a knack for getting by, a sense of how to interact with foreigners, a knowledge of when to ask the shepherd for information, go to the next place. In the years just before Giorgiorini's arrival in London, for example, the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, Makarios ibn Zaim, had traveled from Aleppo to Russia in the company of his son on a mission to raise funds for his community. But this sort of fundraising wasn't restricted only to Eastern Christians. However, rather we need to remember their missions were in direct competition with the activities of Catholic European orders. For example, Franciscans or Geronimites, who also relied on charity from patrons and what was in effect a global industry of alms collecting. This is a picture from the 1850s, but I think it always just gives a feel for what these small groups of often very young men heading off and relying extensively on how much money they could bring in while abroad. They weren't always converting people. It's not for no reason, therefore, that in the Laws of the Indies, published in the Spanish Empire in 1681, an entire chapter was included on legislation related to quitores, or alms collectors. The past decade since John's written has also witnessed a profusion of studies that shed light on the lived experience of these alms collectors. That's to say, the practices, the itineraries, and forms of record keeping used by these individuals. We know, for example, that the routes traveled by alms collectors frequently began in Italy, normally in Rome, where Eastern Christians presented themselves to Catholic authorities in search not only of donations, but more importantly, letters of recommendation they hoped would facilitate their travel and movement across Europe. Evidence from the 17th century suggests that these itineraries tended to follow mostly a Catholic route, from Italy to France to Spain, although there's enough evidence from Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and as we've seen with Giorgiorini's, from England, to suggest that their presence in Protestant lands was not exceptional. To give a feel for the numbers of people involved, the Italian scholar Cesare Santos has surveyed record books kept at the Propaganda Fide, which is the main institution to which many alms collectors would first present themselves upon arriving in Rome. Santos's research reveals that as many as 3,000 Eastern Christians presented themselves to Catholic officials from Rome over a period of 150 years from 1620 onwards. I mean, the evidence itself is lovely, because for each of these individuals, as a good secretary of the Propaganda Fide would do, they record the name, the appearance, the stated place of origin, and scribbled a profession of faith made by the person on the spot to prove that they're actually Catholic. But the size of this phenomenon, I think, is the most important. The colors here, I think, just speak to the heavy place of Armenians and Eastern Christians in some of these presentations. But you can find them also coming from Central Europe and other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so much of our knowledge of the experiences of these individuals depends on the happenstance of what has survived in the archives, and how, and where. Now, incredibly, Barron's account of Giorgiorini's manages to reveal the Archbishop distributed little wooden crosses while in Italy, along with pebbles brought from the Holy Cave of the Revelation on Patmos. This is an example of an 18th century cross made in Bethlehem to give a taste of the sorts of things we might expect Giorgiorini's to have been carrying. Now, these bits of evidence are rare pearls indeed. We also know that Giorgiorini's carried with him 2 Byzantine manuscripts, which he gifted to the Royal Library of Louis XIV. And from similar gifts made to libraries across Europe, we know that manuscripts featured regularly in the array of objects carried by alms collectors. Yet this is a field that is changing still dynamically with every new find. Consider, for example, the acquisition in 2019 by the Gennadius Library of this paper icon, of an engraving of a general view of Mount Sinai printed in 18th century Vienna. The paper icon included an undated letter in Latin. It's up here. I'm sorry, it's not very clear. You could read it anyway, it's so small. Included an undated letter in Latin signed by the Archbishop of Sinai, Athanasius IV, asking European princes for financial help. A sure sign of papers like this being deployed as one of many strategies used by alms collectors like Giorgiorini's. We've also learned much in recent years about the detailed records that alms collectors themselves kept in the form of account books, diaries, and even albums complete with signatures of the Europeans they encountered and dined with and took money from as they met them abroad. One example here is a notebook dating from the 1740s that was discovered some years ago in, of all places, the Canton archives of Chur in Switzerland. Its mix of Arabic, Harshuni, and Italian suggests a provenance from Mesopotamia, and the manuscript is divided into two sections: a cash book, recording income and expenses, and a journal, a text describing the actual travels themselves, interesting things found along the way. The important point here is that such sources may reveal a great deal about levels of literacy among alms collectors. Other recent finds show that these notebooks were portable, easily placed into a pocket during a journey. This one's no larger than your hand. Now, given how few are the surviving examples of Giorgiorini's written Greek, and we have only a few examples, very short ones, one must wonder whether he himself kept such a journal, which I hope lay somewhere on a shelf in an archive waiting for an intrepid graduate student to find it. So one last point I should make here concerns the actual activities comprised within the umbrella of alms collecting. What does it mean? What are we talking about when we refer to alms collecting in this way, in this period? Now, in the 17th century at least, this involved alms collectors normally doing one of two things. First, they tended to present themselves to institutions, municipalities, and towns with petitions explaining the reasons for their collecting alms. Records of those sorts of activities are often scribbled into notarial archives or into small town records, and often in conditions like this at the moment. This is from Puerto de Santa Maria in Spain. So, to give you a feel of those sorts of sources. These petitions often tell three main reasons used by alms collectors to ask for alms. First, the need to liberate a family member allegedly taken captive or enslaved. Second, the need to pay the Ottoman poll tax that was paid by non-Muslims during this period. And finally, the need for money to support general needs of rebuilding of a church or a specific community. Now, beyond these stories, alms collectors practiced a second form of activity wherein they traveled around celebrating public masses, usually in their own indigenous languages, at the end of which they'd be permitted to take up a collection for themselves. Now, these masses were sometimes the subject of printed publications or news items in local gazettes, such as this account of a Chaldean mass celebrated by an East Syrian alms collector in Paris in 1673. Now, this world, these two activities, would all change in a later period, when the second type of public-facing, ceremonial, sacramental sort of alms collecting became more and more rare. Indeed, from the mid-18th century, Eastern Christian alms collectors were increasingly treated within the architecture of systems related to such things as poor relief, vagabonds, and the legislation seeking to control urban migration. You get fewer and fewer of those sort of public masses celebrated for the collection of alms afterwards. But in the world of Giorgiorini's, at least until then, the performance of ritual, liturgy, and devotion remained central to the collection of alms. Now, John was lucky, because writing in 2006, he could be blissfully unaware of this literature which hadn't come yet. And yet his research in many ways presaged the development of an entire field of studies. However, what I really want to focus on in the time that remains is a second development that has also taken place within early modern history over the past decade or so. Now, this relates to the growing fascination among early modernists in certain ideas of dissimulation, of fakery, and especially impostorhood in the early modern world. In the shadow of classic works, like Natty Zeman Davis's account of the return of Martin Guerre, there have been two main strands of research that have developed here. The first involves a constellation of developments that witness the rise of documentary practices of identification. That's to say, the use by individuals of an array of documents, seals, and institutions to prove the authenticity of who they were, and accordingly the interest of states, churches, and all sorts of institutions in surveying and seeing those sorts of documents. Now, Giorgiorini's was very attuned to the importance of documents in the world around him, which is revealed beautifully in a passage where Barron describes how the Archbishop reacted to the fact that someone was traveling around England impersonating him. Around 1675, Giorgiorini's takes out a public advertisement in the London Gazette to warn people about this impostor. A Greek minister of a high stature with a black bushy hair and a long black beard, whose real name is Joachim Siciliano, from the Isle of Kefalonia, has gone up and down this country under the name of the Bishop of Samos in Greece. And he's been given Christian contributions towards building a Greek church, which he hath lewdly spent. Now, setting the record straight, he is here. To prevent any further abuse to the country, these are to give notice that the said Bishop of Samos, that's to say George Arenas himself, is actually an indifferent tall man, slender, long black hair, having a wart on the right side of his nose just against his eye, a cut under his right eye, and black whiskers with very little beard. Now, this recent literature on identification among modern historians has developed in tandem with a second trend or fashion in early modern history, which has been to characterize the Reformation itself as having provided the momentum and the framework for individuals to increasingly adopt religious identities that they did not actually hold. I'm simplifying here. But the argument is basically that the hardening of boundaries between different confessional identities, Catholic and Protestant, resulted in increased pressure on individuals to conform publicly to these identities, regardless of their internal beliefs. In its widest expressions, this literature and this view of religious dissimulation has now become globalized. That's to say, Catholics pretending to be Protestants, Shi'is pretending to be Sunnis, Europeans pretending to be Ottomans, and on we go. So to quote from a 2012 work on the subject, early modern Europe was teeming with impostors. Men and women from all walks of life were reinventing, fabricating, and disguising themselves, lying about who they were or pretending to be someone they were not. And as a result, authorities, religious and secular, were frantically creating new means for ascertaining each person's identity. Now, this race began with the dawn of civilization. For example, Odysseus disguising himself as a beggar to enter Troy, or the biblical Jacob stealing his father's blessing by impersonating Esau, or the Gileadites identifying the Ephraimites by their inability to pronounce Shibboleth, as you will. And this has never ended. Now, here's not the place to take up this argument itself. Instead, I want only to make a point here about how this idea of the 17th century as an age of impostors has come to dominate scholarship in recent years. And what does that mean for our dear Archbishop? Well, why not? Everyone loves an impostor. Impostors make for great human stories. They resonate with our contemporary anxieties about credibility, fake news, and identity theft. And most importantly, they help sell trade books. That's actually, I've included Matt Hancock, it's a bit unkind of me. But anyway, just to give you a feel of the concern this day more than ever about impostors, things that aren't what they appear to be. Now, in this way, it's perhaps not a surprise that the language of impostors has come to saturate the bloodstream of the study of Eastern Christian alms collectors. Today, many of these works revolve around ideas of self-fashioning. Recent articles refer to the many who deceived us, to the great imposture, and even Eastern Christian counterfeits and rogues. And what do such approaches offer for the study of someone like the Archbishop of Samos? An Anglican in London? A Catholic in Buenos Aires? An Orthodox bishop in Samos? For historians faced with these sorts of contradictions, the easy answer, I want to suggest, is simply to throw up our hands and write them off as yet another example of early modern dissimulation. However, I think this approach is deeply problematic. Not only does it ignore the complexity of the sources about such individuals, but such an approach flattens the profile of individuals, waters down the idiosyncrasies of their worldviews, their beliefs. Put simply, the idea of impostors lets too many historians off very easily, and it risks distorting our understanding of belief and belonging in the world of George Arenas. We can see this problem if we consider the anxieties that Europeans did actually express about Eastern Christians, concerns which themselves changed over time. It's clear, for example, that by the end of the 16th century, there was already what one scholar has described as a deep mistrust among Western Europeans when it came to the credibility of Greeks. One consensus even in the writings of someone like Martin Crusius, the Lutheran scholar who in 1584 published his esoteric and encyclopedic Turco-Graecia, which told of the dozens and dozens of Greek alms collectors he had hosted in his own home in Tübingen. Like other scholars who followed him, Crusius located the decline in the heresy of the Greeks not only in the poor comparison they made to their ancient ancestors, but also to their having been infected since 1453 by the rule of the Ottoman Turks. Now, these sorts of tropes, you'll find them anywhere you start looking for them, even in legislation of the period, such as those laws of the Indies that I mentioned, which single out Armenians, Greeks, and monks of Mount Sinai as alms collectors who could not be trusted, unlike, it must be said, good, true Catholics. Now, these sorts of traditions, scholarly, legal, historic, were rarely invoked when it came to specific episodes of everyday encounters between Europeans and Eastern Christians. Instead, the real focus of concerns about alms collectors revolved around the actual paperwork they carried with them. When George Arrhenius turned up in Buenos Aires, for example, he presented as proof of his identity documents that the Spanish officials inspected very closely and described as, quote, 2 bulls on parchment, many letters written in gold, all in Arabic, in the shape of a crescent moon. I'll just give you some example of Ottoman letters of investiture, barons, and what they looked like, and actually the Spanish officials, I thought, were pretty decent philologists as well, just to get a feel of the document. In other examples, we find alms collectors carrying letters of recommendation, certificates confirming their Catholic identities, even alba amicorum with signatures from notables they had met in Europe. This is one example. Another monk from Athos, slightly later, nowhere near as interesting as George Arrhenius, so we didn't worry. Faced with these documents, Europeans rarely challenged the stories or the claims made in the papers, but rather they focused instead on philological and material analysis of the documents themselves in an attempt to ensure that the documents were authentic. In some cases, they even went so far as to question the context in which these documents were generated. In 1700, for example, Eusèbe Renaudot, the Orientalist and theologian, warned against trusting letters of recommendation that had been signed by Catholic missionaries in Aleppo. He insisted that these missionaries were only writing these letters after having been bullied by local Eastern Christians to do so. As Renaudot says it, Eastern Christians would threaten to accuse the missionaries to Ottoman officials of trying to convert Muslims to Christianity if they didn't give them the letters they wanted. When it came to the actual identities of Eastern Christians, therefore, the extent of European concerns about alms collectors extended above all to the question of their confessional identity. In other words, were they really Catholic or Protestant, as they claimed to be? And in the confessional context of the Reformation, there were only two possible answers to this question. Either they were Catholic or Protestant, or they retained their previous schismatic belief in Eastern Christianity. Now, in general, it's fair to say that these two limited possibilities are reflected in the approaches that modern historians take today in the study of Eastern Christians in Europe. And this recalls a more general challenge facing Reformation historians that has been raised by Alex Walsham in a different context, when she writes, and I'm quoting here, how do we conceptualize, how do we explain religious change without perpetuating the distorting paradigms inherited from the very era of the past that is the subject of our study? How can we do justice to historical development over time without resorting to grand narratives that have their intellectual origins in the very movements that we seek to comprehend? The shadow of the Reformation looms very large over contemporary scholarship on Eastern Christians in general, but especially on these alms collectors. Now, needless to say, Barron's account of George Arrhenius is gloriously free of any of this early modern baggage. You certainly won't find the word impostor anywhere in the work, nor even the sense of George Arrhenius, the intimation of George Arrhenius as a religious pretender. Instead, he brings that even-handedness in the treatment of evidence that is so central to the work of ancient historians, particularly when one is dealing with fragments, with material culture, with numismatics. In particular, Barron's idea of the unorthodox life, or the spiritual entrepreneur, something that we've discussed before, Caroline. This idea pays enormous dividends and offers a very productive way forward to understanding Eastern Christianity in this period on its own terms, liberated from the shadow of the Reformation. In the short time that remains, what I want to do is to use the words of John Davies' first memorial lecture, and to build on Barron, and particularly on the attention that John gives to evidence from Giorgiorini's life of moments that I shall call improvisation, by which I mean evidence that appears to document unplanned, spontaneous actions, utterances, writings, physical movements, gestures even, that were used by Eastern Christians to communicate their identities to European audiences. Let me explain why I think these moments are interesting. Eastern Christians regularly found themselves in situations where they were asked, challenged, or interrogated about their religious identities by Europeans, and I use the word interrogated purposefully here. They were therefore obliged to provide answers, often on the spot, and sometimes under personal pressure, and in situations where they were, from a material perspective, precarious. Now, for their part, Europeans invested these moments with great importance, seeing in them an opportunity to assess the authenticity of the claims made by Eastern Christians about their religious beliefs. This is the Freudian slip before Freud. However, our problem today is that the records of these moments of improvisation survive invariably only in accounts written by Europeans themselves. So to take an example from Giorgiorini's, Barron's research uncovered a note written by the English scholar and one-time chaplain to the Levant Company, Thomas Smith, of a promise that had been made by Giorgiorini's that his church would remain in communion with the Church of England. The statement was annotated with these words by Thomas Smith, who described it as the Archbishop's renouncing the superstition of the Romish and Greek Church and his promise to give no scandal to the public exercise of his religion. And this was the note, this was the promise. We renounce transubstantiation of the Holy Mystery as a superstition recently established by the Romans. We renounce also the Synod of Bethlehem with all its false teaching which the Romans have introduced into the Eastern Church. We promise not to place icons in our church in London, not to worship, revere, or serve anyone but God alone, nor to pray for the dead as the Romans pray, nor to hold any service which would be contrary to that of the Anglican Church or would give scandal to it. Thus we renounce, thus we promise in the name of God. I always hear Kyrieleison, Kyrieleison, Kyrieleison after a moment like that. Now some of you will be immediately struck by the resemblance of the text to the professions of faith that one encounters across the history of Christianity in the West. Especially during the Reformation, professions of faith became an important mechanism for rival Christian confessions to draw boundaries between themselves by enumerating the specific content of their beliefs. Now these sorts of documents are in fact much less common within Eastern Christianity. Except in this period, for in those instances, when Europeans have solicited, requested, often demanded professions of faith from Eastern Christians themselves. In 1673, for example, the French ambassador in Constantinople, the Marquis de Nointel, embarked on a mission that lasted 17 months, during which he traveled to Chios, the Cyclades, Palestine, Egypt, Athens, all the way collecting signed professions of faith from any Eastern Christian priest, bishop, or patriarch he encountered. Some of these will later be published in the Perpetuité de la Foi, which appears in John's book. Now Barron was right to be skeptical when he came across this document by Thomas Smith, and he wondered in a footnote whether in fact it was really produced by Giorgiorini's himself. Now we can glimpse something of the processes behind the generation of such texts if we expand our vision and consider an episode described in 1652 by a Carmelite missionary, Dionysius of the Crown of Thorns. This is, in 1652, Dionysius had been dispatched here by the Propaganda Fide to travel to the Nestorian Patriarch in an attempt to persuade him to a union with Rome. Dionysius spent several days conversing with the Patriarch, after which the missionary sent a copy of a profession of faith that had been written and signed by the Patriarch himself, along with a short, breezy account of how he had obtained it. He writes, this is Dionysius, 2 days after my arrival, there happened something which caused me much surprise. The Patriarch was writing the above letter, the Confession of Faith, to His Holiness, and I was present. But in order that everything might go forth with greater frankness and sincerity, I determined not to say anything, and to allow them to act whether for good or for evil. In other words, to let them write whatever they write. So be it. Now, when the historians had finished, the patriarch begged me to say whether what they had written was well said. They had written, Vobis et nobis est tua fides eunus synodis, you and we have one and the same faith and synod. I immediately took notice of it, and then asked them, well, which synod they meant to speak of, seeing that there were 4 general councils, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, and they, you could almost see this, if you imagine the scene, they sort of look over, inquired of me whether all these 4 were recognized by the See of St. Peter. We can see Dionysius nodding. Well, when I answered yes, the patriarch had reflected for a little regarding that one of Ephesus, and they then added that they too held all 4 councils to be true, and they accepted all the See of St. Peter and Paul accepted. And what we see here, and these glimpses are rare, but this is an exception. Missionaries are quite good at talking about how good they are at pushing people around and getting them to sign things they want them to sign. And what we see here is the extent to which European Christians were complicit in the process that produced professions of faith, such as those carried by Georgianis and his ilk. It would be problematic to use such sources as some sort of litmus test of religious belief, because these professions were regularly produced in response to European expectations, and often with European nudges, suggestions, and pressures. Now, this point about pressure and the precarious position of alms collectors is one I want to demonstrate with reference to one final episode. Now, this involves an account of a mass celebrated in the Royal Chapel in Paris in 1670 by a priest from Mosul who claimed to those present that he was in fact Catholic. Now, the only surviving account of this episode comes from the pen of Richard Simon, an Orientalist and theologian who happened to be present on the occasion we know to celebrate. As it turned out, the priest, Elias, that's his name, did not have anyone with him to serve as a deacon. And so Simon gladly offered himself for the task, which gave him, as he would write later, a perfect place from which to watch closely over the actions of the priest during the Mass. And at the end of this Mass would be the regular collection of alms. So we have to imagine, anyone who knows the liturgy can imagine the proximity of the priest and the deacon circling the altar at various points, and the extent to which these moments of interaction between them offer spaces. Anyone's ever seen an altar boy trying to figure out what to do next, for just sort of figuring it out on the spot. I'll let Simon's account speak for itself. He writes, throughout the Mass, I was standing near the priest and officiating as his deacon. I was able to follow his place in the Syriac Missal that he was using for the occasion. I noticed, therefore, that when it came to the point at which he should have said the words, "This is my body," he proceeded to raise the Eucharist into the air long before pronouncing those words. So I took him aside immediately. You can see Richard fuming at this point. Took him aside immediately after the Mass, upbraiding him and telling him that since he had elevated the host before saying, "This is my body," the worshippers had all adored the Eucharist before it had been consecrated. Now at this point, we never get Elias's voice in this, but at this point in the written account, Elias was silent. He only looked at Simon before responding that he hadn't actually elevated it, but he'd only raised it, quote, poco a poco, while he was saying the words. Just sort of. Now Simon, of course, jumped back in. I continued to press him, telling him such a thing wasn't written anywhere in the missal he carried, and that any Eastern Christian in union with Rome should know better. The priest, he tells us, was flustered, and reassured Simon he had no beliefs other than the Catholic faith. But Simon continues to flog a dead horse. I know that cannot be the case, because at the moment, in the separate account he writes, at the moment of the Paraclesis, which is the litany is given for the Church Fathers, the various saints, I was reading his lips, and I saw him whisper the name Nestorius. I later grabbed his missal and looked through it, and I found the exact spot where I could just barely see that the letters of the word Nestorius had been erased from his book. I tell you this to insist upon you, one cannot believe this priest is anything other than a Nestorian, and certainly not a real cow. There's a bunch of interest in the episode, but I'll only emphasize here two things. First of all, the text reminds us of the very embodied nature of these interactions between individuals divided often by asymmetries of power. This isn't to say that Eastern Christians are always the weak ones in this formula, as I've tried to suggest from the bullying missionaries in order to get a letter of recommendation issued for you. Was the priest Elias Catholic or Nestorian? Well, who knows? But we can feel the nervousness in him as he struggles to come up with a solution to a situation where he finds himself under fire, quite literally, from Simon. Something similar happened to Georgianis when he was asked to explain to Thomas Smith why the Greeks only gave infant communion in wine and not also in bread. And Barron has a lovely passage where Georgianis flubs an answer that, well, babies of 1 or 2 years old, their digestive systems aren't really ready for bread. And he puts a spoon in a chalice and says, this is sort of, it kind of just works. Smith, for what it's worth, calls that ludicrous. The second point from this episode is to flag the extent to which contemporary accounts of what look at first glance to us like improvised, spontaneous moments of religiosity actually reveal themselves upon inspection to be heavily informed by European anxieties, suspicions, and fantasies about Eastern Christianity. In other words, the sources themselves are already hardwired with Reformation ways of seeing the world, often in black or white. People like Richard Simon, or indeed the Anglicans who encountered Georgianis, worked from a script where the possibilities of Eastern Christian belief were limited. They were either Protestants or Catholics, as they claimed to be, in the making, or they were hiding their schismatic beliefs. Now, through such lenses, it's almost impossible to see these alms collectors as anything other than impostors, when the accounts of them that survive today are both judge and jury. So, how do early modernists get beyond the inherited assumptions of their field, indeed, the Reformation itself? As I've tried to suggest, many of the answers lay in the example of John Barron's scholarship on the Archbishop of Samos. And from Samos to Soho isn't simply an amusing story about a Greek archbishop. And I'll say that again, it's not just a cutesy little story about a Greek archbishop. And it would be a real shame if that was how it was read or remembered. Instead, the research has three real accomplishments. First of all, Barron reminds us that exchanges between Europeans and Eastern Christians took place imperfectly and through the fog of multilingualism. This attention to language is a recurring theme of Barron's book, and one that I think holds immense potential for the study of this period. Secondly, I've suggested that early modern historians should be very cautious of embracing a facile interest in early modern impostors, which risks replicating Reformation paradigms of religious identity. I'll get pilloried for that claim if there's too many early modernists in the room. But I think there's something problematic about the idea of the impostor in terms of what it produces for analysis of the early modern world. Even accounts that appear to give us access to moments of improvisation are in fact opaque. They require as much care and interpretation as the study of a clipped coin found in a Viking hoard. Third, and most importantly, I want to suggest that the study of people like Georgianis needs to begin from the premise that there were multiple options of religious belief available to individuals in the 17th century, many of which don't fit easily into our own historical conceptions of the Reformation or the early modern world. And I think Caroline puts her finger on this perfectly in the introduction to the book, when she wonders whether Georgianis was in fact an ecumenist ahead of his time. I'd go even a step further, and I'd say that Eastern Christians like Georgianis regarded their communities, if not as the center of Christianity, then at least as autonomous Christians, with their own independent visions of their past, their present, and their future. So long as modern historians are seduced by the Reformation search for impostors, we will not be able to see these communities for what they actually were. Not just traditionalist churches refusing to change, not Catholic converts new to the world or Protestant sympathizers, but rather what Peter Brown has called, in a different context, a series of little robes, each of them with their own sets of priorities, preoccupations, and concerns, puffing themselves up and thinking of themselves as a world religion. Now, for some of these Eastern Christians, friendship and proximity with Protestantism or Catholicism was a genuine path they were sincerely willing to pursue, so long as they could do so on their own terms. But that really is the subject of another lecture. So let me end here where we began, with the words of Russell Meggs and his prophetic comment about the young John Barron and how useful his work would be for others. Now, of course, I focused only on one book, one article, one thread. But of course, Barron's work encompassed so much more. And this is something I feel I've come to know without knowing him, from his scholarship, from his contributions to the study of classics in the UK, from the central role that he played here in London and the Institute that's played through him, from the accounts of him written by his teachers, his students, his family. It is very clear that John thrived in the many forms of work in which scholars spread their talents in higher education today. The rhythms of teaching, lecturing, examining, the mix of administrative responsibilities, committees, reports, meetings, seminars, and the constant care for students and colleagues, sometimes even cantankerous colleagues, long before words like welfare or well-being were even coined. Now, all of this rumbled on daily, I imagine, alongside the everyday joys and challenges of life with family, with children, with friends. And so the importance of the Archbishop of Samos may, perhaps should, fade away when placed in the context of all these other accomplishments. However, for readers like me, and I imagine for readers like you, John's work on the Archbishop is a reminder of the importance of persevering with small doses of research, carved out from wherever you can find it. For without them, it can sometimes feel like we are breathing on only one lung. And for this reason, I'm ever so grateful for having stumbled upon the Archbishop of Samos in the Spanish archives, and for the Archbishops leading me to John's research. Meggs was right, I think I can say. Early modernists can learn a lot from John's work. He reminds us that we need to work harder to find the widest possible range of evidence. We also need to work a bit slower in thinking judiciously about how to interpret that evidence, and remembering always not only the evidence we possess, but more importantly, the long list of things we don't have in front of us. And above all, we need to explore our subjects as if we are outsiders with the eyes of a neophyte, untainted by the legacies of scholars in the past, and not easily seduced by the fashionable models of the present. In this way, From Samos to Soho, offers something of a blood transfusion for early modernists, all the more impressive as it comes to us from an ancient historian working far beyond the specialization of his original field. In this way, John's legacy is also a reminder of the importance of being ecumenical. And I don't mean this in a religious sense, but in an intellectual one. That's to say, the crossing of multiple fields, the pursuit of knowledge, the frontiers of different disciplines, and the importance of letting ourselves fall down rabbit holes when we find them, even if the journey takes a lifetime. So it's a great honor to play a small role in remembering John and his work tonight. And it's also most appropriate that we celebrate his memory together here at the Institute for Classical Studies, but also at places like St. Peter's and Balliol and Bedford College and King's, and the list goes on and on. Indeed, in any community that is held together by the charisma of gregarious scholars with capacious interests. If we are lucky, this comes from the DPhil, if we are lucky, these are the sorts of people who will continue to breathe new life into old worlds, and in doing so, they remind us of the redeeming power of historical scholarship.